Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
Let me paint you a picture, or better yet, a motion picture. 3 scenes, 3 dates, same regional setting, and 1 actor, a president. Scene 1, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, May 13th, 2025. The President of the United States stands at the United States and Saudi Investment Forum and delivers a speech that is received as historic. He denounces the foreign policy of his predecessors. He calls them by name, neoconservatives, nation builders, and liberal nonprofits. He says the gleaming marvels of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were not built by Western interventionists. He says the so-called nation builders, in his exact words, wrecked far more nations than they built. He receives a standing ovation. Commentators call it the rejection of 2 decades of failed foreign policy. Scene 2, Tehran. February 28th, 2026. 9 months and 15 days after the Riyadh speech. The United States and Israel launch Operation Epic Fury, the largest American military operation in the Middle East in over 20 years. The opening salvo kills the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. It kills senior commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It kills the Iranian defense minister. The president, who 9 months earlier had denounced nation builders, now describes the strikes as a strategic necessity to remove a security threat. He urges the Iranian people to topple their government. Scene 3. Yesterday, April 25th, 2026. The president posts on Truth Social. He has just canceled a planned trip by his envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, to peace talks in Islamabad. The Iranian foreign minister had arrived but left when the American delegates did not show. The president writes that there is, in his words, tremendous infighting and confusion within the Iranian leadership. He writes, and I quote him exactly, "Nobody knows who's in charge, including them." The president is right. Nobody knows who's in charge of Iran. The reason nobody knows is that the United States and Israel have spent the past 2 months killing the people who would have been in charge. The supreme leader, dead. The pragmatist secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, the man President Pezeshkian appointed last August to lead Iran's negotiating team, dead. Senior IRGC commanders, dead. Nuclear scientists, dead. The defense minister, dead. The architecture of Iranian governments has been decapitated by the very country now expressing surprise that that architecture is incoherent. This is not an unfortunate complication of war. This is the predictable result of deliberate decapitation policy. We've seen it before. We have seen it in Iraq. We have seen it in Libya. We have seen it in Syria. We are now watching it happen in Iran. The pattern is consistent. The pattern is documented. The pattern is the subject of today's episode. In episode 15, I issued a charge to the listeners of this program: counter ignorance with information seeking, counter apathy with engagement. We are a highly intelligent society. We have the capacity to see through the parlor tricks of false framing and errant labels, so long as we apply the lessons we have learned. Today's parlor trick is one of the oldest. The cheerleaders for war tell us that intervention is noble. They tell us that we are liberating a people. They tell us that our sons and daughters fight not for empire, but for freedom, for women, for Christians, for moderates, for the dissidents, for the next generation of a captive society waiting to be set free. I want to test that claim against the evidence. Not the rhetorical claim, the empirical claim. The claim that intervention liberates. Across the next hour, we will examine 4 interventions of the past quarter century: Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and Syria. And we will ask, in each case, what happened to the women? What happened to the Christians? What happened to the moderates? What happened to the country itself? Then we will examine 4 countries where the United States did not intervene militarily: Tunisia, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. And we will ask the same questions. Finally, we will examine Iran in 2026, where the pattern is unfolding before our eyes, and we will ask whether the cheerleader for this latest war can offer one example, one in 25 years, where the women they claim to be liberating ended up freer than before. The central question of this series remains, did this leave Americans more free or more governed? But today, the question expands. Did this leave anyone more free? Or has the pattern always been the opposite? That the population sold to the American public as the beneficiaries of liberation have ended up, in every case we examine, the casualties of it. The president was right in Riyadh. He has since proved his own thesis by doing the opposite. That contradiction is where we begin. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 16, part B of the series, Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, whose liberation? Whose loss? The pattern of intervention's aftermath, from Baghdad to Tehran. Episode 16, the corresponding historical episode released this past Saturday, examined the Arab Spring and its winter, the cascade of Western interventions that followed the 2011 uprisings, particularly in Libya and Syria. Today, we extend that pattern's logic forward and outward. We examine what happens when American military power is sold to the public as a force for liberation, and what happens in countries where it is not deployed, where populations are simply left to determine their own course. The contrast, I argue, is unmistakable. Let us begin. The case for intervention is almost always framed as a moral case. We must act because the regime is brutal. We must act because the women are oppressed. We must act because the religious minorities are at risk. We must act because the moderates need our help. We must act because, if we do not, the alternative is unthinkable. The case is deployed with conviction. It is delivered by people who genuinely believe it. It is repeated by the media who genuinely amplify it. It produces wars that, by the end, leave the women devastated, the religious minorities decimated, the moderates eliminated, and the country itself in ruins. Then a new generation of policymakers steps forward to make the same case for the next intervention, citing none of the previous failures and remembering, apparently, none of the consequences. Let us walk through the record. Iraq. In 2003, Iraq was a brutal autocracy. Saddam Hussein was a monstrous figure who had murdered hundreds of thousands of his own people, gassed Kurdish villages, and waged aggressive war against his neighbors. And nothing that I am about to say should be taken to defend him. But Iraq was also a secular Ba'athist state. Iraq had been the first Arab country to appoint a female cabinet minister back in the 1950s. It had appointed its first female judge in 1959, a major advance in the Arab world at the time. By the early 1980s, Iraqi women made up roughly 40% of the workforce. The 1970 Constitution declared women equal to men before the law. Saddam himself reversed some of these gains in his later years, barring women from the Judicial Institute in 1984, granting immunity to honor killers in 1990 to appease religious factions. But the secular framework in which the urban women were typically unveiled, attended mixed-genders university, and worked in professional life, remained largely intact through 2003. It had one of the oldest continuous Christian communities in the world. Chaldean, Assyrian, Syriac, Armenian, tracing back by tradition to the missionary work of St. Thomas in the 1st century. Before the 2003 invasion, Iraq was home to approximately 1.5 million Christians. They were not safe under Saddam, but they existed. Their ancient churches stood. Their language, Aramaic, the language of Christ, was spoken in liturgy directly. After the American invasion, after the dissolution of the Iraqi army and through de-Baathification, after the sectarian civil war, after al-Qaeda in Iraq, after the rise of ISIS, after the fall of Mosul in 2014, after the genocide declared by the European Parliament, the Iraqi Christian population had collapsed. The numbers are stark. By 2024, the State Department estimated that the number of Christians in Iraq had fallen from 1.2 million in 2011 to 120,000. Other counts place the figure between 150,000 and 250,000, but whatever the precise number, more than 80% of Iraqi Christians had fled the country since the American invasion. Mosul, which had hosted Christian communities for nearly 2,000 years, was emptied of them. The first Sunday since the age of the apostles that no mass was celebrated in Mosul came in the summer of 2014, 11 years after Americans were told the invasion would liberate Iraq. The women of Iraq fared no better. The secular framework that had allowed women in the cities to work, to study unveiled, to participate in professional life, that framework did not survive the sectarian chaos that followed the invasion. Iraqi women's organizations themselves reported in 2006 that women were treated better and their rights were more respected under Saddam Hussein than they were under the new order. ISIS instituted slave markets, the actual word, the actual practice, in the year 2014 for Yazidi women. Christian women who could not flee fast enough were captured. Honor killings, kidnappings, and forced marriages became routine in the region where state authority had collapsed. Female unemployment doubled in the years following the invasion. The threat of sectarian violence and religious enforcement made unaccompanied movement dangerous in much of the country. This was the liberation Americans were sold. Libya. In 2011, Muammar Gaddafi was a brutal autocrat who had ruled Libya for 42 years. He had supported terrorism. He had ordered the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. He had imprisoned, tortured, and murdered his political opponents. And nothing I am about to say should be taken to defend him. But Libya under Gaddafi had achieved the highest Human Development Index in Africa, according to the 2010 United Nations Human Development Report, ranked 53rd in the world. Adult literacy approached 90%. Youth female literacy approached 100%. Women served in his bodyguard, in the military, in universities, in professional life. Healthcare was universal. Education was free and compulsory through the age of 15. The country was internally stable. Its borders were controlled. Its weapons stockpiles were secured. When the Arab Spring reached Libya in early 2011, the United States, under President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton, joined a NATO intervention sold as humanitarian. Gaddafi must go, the public was told, because he was massacring his own people. The intervention would be limited. It would be surgical. It would protect civilians. By October 2011, NATO-supported rebels found Gaddafi hiding in a drainage pipe near Sirte. They beat him. They sodomized him with a bayonet. They killed him in the street. Hillary Clinton, asked about it on CBS, laughed and said, "We came, we saw, he died." That video circulated for years. What followed in Libya is the case study for what happens when a state is decapitated and replaced with nothing. The country fractured. Tripoli and Benghazi fell to competing militias. Weapons from Gaddafi's stockpiles flooded the Sahel, arming jihadist insurgencies in Mali, Niger, and across West Africa for years afterwards. ISIS established a foothold on the Mediterranean coast, and in November of 2017, CNN published verified undercover video footage of slave auctions, open-air sales of African migrants being sold for as little as $400 each. In Libya, in the year 2017, 6 years after the country had been liberated by NATO bombs. The women of Libya did not benefit from the intervention. The high female literacy rate of the Gaddafi era did not survive the militia rule that followed. Women in Tripoli today report less freedom of movement, less workplace participation, and more religious enforcement than they had experienced under the autocrat we removed. The Christian communities of Libya, smaller but ancient, dispersed entirely. The country that had been the most developed in Africa was, within 5 years, divided between rival governments and exporting armed jihadists in every direction. This, too, was the liberation Americans were sold. Afghanistan. In October of 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan. The Taliban regime was brutal and theologically extreme. Women were forbidden to attend school past the age of 8. They could not appear in public without a male guardian. They could not work. They could not travel. The case for intervention, especially regarding women, was widely accepted. For the next 20 years, the United States waged the longest war in its history. American forces and their NATO allies maintained urban centers, particularly in Kabul, where women's lives improved markedly. Girls went to school, women served in the parliament, female journalists, doctors, and police officers became visible. The optimistic case held that, given enough time, these gains would consolidate and the Afghan civil society would carry them forward after Western forces departed. In August of 2021, after a chaotic withdrawal under President Biden, Kabul fell to the Taliban in 11 days. The government we had spent 20 years and $2 trillion building collapsed faster than anyone in Washington had publicly predicted. Within weeks, the Taliban had reimposed every restriction on women that defined their previous rule and several that had not. Girls were barred from secondary school and then from university. Women were barred from most employment. Female health workers were forbidden to treat male patients, and male health workers were forbidden to treat female patients, meaning in practice that women in many provinces could not access medical care at all. The Afghan women whose hopes had been raised for 20 years now lived under a regime more restrictive than the one we had originally invaded to remove. They had been used as the moral justification for a war, and then, when the war ended, abandoned to a worse version of what had preceded it. The American administrators who had spent 2 decades making the moral case for the intervention offered no accounting. And this, too, was the liberation Americans were sold. Syria. In 2011, the Syrian uprising began as a peaceful protest movement against the regime of Bashar al-Assad, the latest of the family dynasty's brutal rule. The United States, again under President Obama, declared early that Assad must go. American policy, formalized through CIA program Timber Sycamore, began arming what the press uniformly called moderate rebels. The moderate rebels, in case after case, turned out to be jihadists. Weapons supplied to vetted opposition groups ended up in the hands of al-Nusra Front, al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate. Al-Nusra eventually rebranded itself as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, under the leadership of Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, who later adopted the name Ahmed al-Shara. Until late 2025, al-Shara was on the United States State Department's terrorist list. There was a $10 million bounty on his head. In December of 2024, after years of stalemate, HTS forces swept into Damascus and overthrew the Assad regime. Assad fled to Moscow. Al-Shara became the de facto head of state. In May 2025, 8 months ago, President Trump, the same president who had denounced nation builders in Riyadh that very same week, shook hands with al-Shara and announced the lifting of all U.S. sanctions on Syria. The terrorist, whose head we had placed a bounty, became in 8 months the Syrian leader we recognized as a partner. What this means for Syria's religious minorities is not yet fully clear, but the early indicators are not encouraging. The Christian population of Syria has fallen from approximately 1.5 million before the civil war to roughly 300,000 today. Alawite communities, Assad's own sect, face attacks and revenge killings. Druze enclaves report increasing pressure. Women in HTS-controlled regions during the war were subjected to strict religious dress codes. Whether the new central government will impose these codes nationally remains an open question. The Syrian intervention did not produce a liberal democracy. It produced a state run by the very jihadists we had spent 15 years fighting elsewhere. The moderate rebels were a fiction. The result was the elevation of an al-Qaeda affiliate to head of state. This, too, was the liberation Americans were sold. 4 countries, 4 interventions, 4 catastrophes. In each case, the intervention was sold on humanitarian grounds. In each case, the women who were supposed to be liberated were devastated. In each case, ancient Christian communities that had survived under brutal autocrats for decades and centuries, were extinguished or dispersed. In each case, the moderates we said we wanted to support were either marginalized, killed, or simply could not survive the chaos that followed. In each case, the populations were left more economically devastated, more physically endangered, and in many measurable ways less free than they had been under the regimes we removed. This is not an argument that prior regimes were good. They were not. Saddam was a monster. Gaddafi was a monster. The Taliban were and are theological extremists. Assad was a butcher. None of these regimes deserve sympathy. The argument is narrower and more important. The argument is that intervention does not deliver what it promises. The argument is that the populations sold to the American public as the beneficiaries of liberation have, in case after documented case, ended up the casualties of it. The cheerleaders for war do not, as a rule, return to acknowledge this. They simply move on to the next intervention. Here's another question the cheerleaders for war rarely ask. What happens in Middle Eastern countries where the United States has not intervened militarily? Are those countries, by the cheerleaders' own logic, more oppressed? Are their women more constrained? Are their Christian populations smaller? Are their moderates fewer? The answer consistently is the opposite. Tunisia. In December 2010, a young Tunisian fruit vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in protest of corruption and economic despair. His death became the spark of the Arab Spring. Within 28 days, the autocrat Ben Ali had fled to Saudi Arabia. Within months, Tunisians held free elections. Within 4 years, they had ratified what observers called one of the most progressive constitutions in the Arab world. Importantly, for our purpose, the United States did not intervene militarily in Tunisia. France, the former colonial power, actually offered to help Ben Ali suppress the protests. When that offer was declined, the West largely stood back. Tunisians managed their own transition. The results, however imperfect, are remarkable by regional standards. Tunisia is the only country to emerge from the Arab Spring with a functioning democracy. Following its 2014 gender parity law, female representation in parliament reached over 35%, among the highest in the world at that time, and the highest in the Middle East and North Africa. The country adopted a comprehensive law against violence toward women in 2017. In 2015, a coalition of Tunisian civil society organizations won the Nobel Peace Prize for shepherding the country through its democratic transition. In 2021, Tunisia appointed its first female prime minister. A first not just for Tunisia, but for the entire Arab region. Tunisia today is not a paradise. The economy stagnates. Its current president, Kais Saied, has taken authoritarian actions that critics describe as a self-coup. He suspended major articles of the 2014 Constitution in 2021. He dissolved parliament. He removed the gender parity provisions in 2022. Female parliamentary representation, which had peaked above 35%, has fallen to roughly 15% in the current legislature. Democratic backsliding is real, and it cuts hardest against the women's gains. But compared to the trajectory of Libya, its neighbor, where Western intervention produced state collapse and slave markets, compare it to Syria, where Western support for moderate rebels produced jihadist rule. Tunisia, the country we left alone, achieved more in a decade of functioning democracy, the only Arab Spring country to do so, and even in its current backsliding, takes the form of homegrown authoritarianism, not a state collapse, not a sectarian war, not a refugee crisis exporting jihad across borders. Jordan. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan has hosted millions of refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Palestine over the past 2 decades. It maintains diplomatic relations with both Israel and the Arab states. It has never been the target of American military intervention. The status of Jordanian women is, by Middle Eastern standards, advanced and improving. Jordan has never required hijab. Women drive, work, attend university, serve in parliament, and travel without male guardianship requirements. Female labor force participation lags Western levels, but has grown steadily. The country's Christian community, small at roughly 2% of the population, but ancient, remains protected. Churches stand openly in Amman. The ruling Hashemite family explicitly safeguards Christian sites. Is Jordan a perfect democracy? No. The monarchy retains substantial power. Press freedoms are limited, but the trajectory, in measurable terms, is positive. And it is positive without American troops, without American-imposed political reform. The United Arab Emirates, the UAE, formed in 1971 from a federation of Persian Gulf emirates, has become by every available metric one of the most economically and socially dynamic countries in the region. Dubai and Abu Dhabi are cosmopolitan global cities. The country has never been the target of American military intervention. UAE women drive, work, run businesses, hold cabinet positions, and serve as judges and ambassadors. The country has never legally required veil for non-Emirati women. Female labor force participation is among the highest in the Arab world. The UAE has hosted Christian churches openly for decades. The first Catholic church in Abu Dhabi was built in 1962 on land donated by the royal family, and there are today some 7 Coptic Orthodox churches across the country, alongside Catholic, Anglican, and Eastern Orthodox parishes. Pope Francis visited the UAE in 2019 and signed the Document of Human Fraternity with the Grand Imam of Al Azhar, the first papal visit to an Arabian peninsula. The Abu Dhabi government provided land for the Abramatic Family House, a complex on Jihadist Island that includes a mosque, a church, and the country's first synagogue. Opened in 2023. In February 2024, Indian Prime Minister Modi inaugurated the Baps Hindu Mandir in Abu Dhabi, the first traditional Hindu stone temple in the Middle East. Built on land gifted by the UAE president. The UAE is not democratic in the Western sense. Power rests with the ruling families of the 7 Emirates. Political dissent is restricted, but the country has produced, on its own timeline and on its own terms, one of the most religiously diverse and economically free societies in the Muslim world. None of it required American bombs. Saudi Arabia. Saudi is the most complicated case on this list, and I want to be honest about that. The kingdom remains an absolute monarchy. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, has consolidated political power through tactics that include real political repression. Saudi Arabia's investment in the Yemen war has caused enormous civilian suffering. None of these facts should be elided. But the trajectory inside Saudi Arabia, particularly for women, has been remarkable. In 2017, women won the right to drive. In 2019, the legal requirement for women to wear the abaya was lifted. In 2019, the male guardianship requirement for women's travel and many legal matters was abolished. Women now attend mixed-gendered concerts, sporting events, and entertainment venues. Female labor force participation among Saudi nationals, which stood at roughly 19% in 2016, nearly doubled to over 35% by 2022, surpassing the original Vision 2030 target 7 years ahead of schedule. The latest figures from the Saudi government statistics authority place Saudi women's participation at over 36%. Women hold position in businesses, in government, in the diplomatic corps, in journalism, and in the security services. The Saudi reforms are not the result of American military pressure. The United States has never invaded or bombed Saudi Arabia. The reforms are the result of internal political decisions driven by a generational shift in the ruling family and by the economic logic of Vision 2030, the Saudi plan to diversify the economy beyond oil. The kingdom is not a free country. It does not pretend to be. But on the dimensions that the cheerleaders for intervention claim to care about, women's rights, economic dynamism, religious moderation, Saudi Arabia is moving in the right direction, and it is moving there on its own terms. Without American troops, without an American-imposed transition, and without American-led civil war. I am not arguing that any of these countries are perfect. I am arguing that they are exemplary. They are an exemplary of progress that occurs without our military intervention. They are exemplary of populations determining their own course on their own timeline. And here, in May of 2025, the President of the United States articulated this very thesis correctly in Riyadh.
In the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built, and the interventionalists were intervening in complex societies that they did not even understand themselves. They told you how to do it, but they had no idea how to do it themselves. Peace, prosperity, and progress ultimately came not from a radical rejection of your heritage, but rather from embracing your national traditions and embracing that same heritage that you love so dearly.
As the president said, and I reiterate his key claim, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built. He said the gleaming marvels of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were not built by Western interventionists. He said American policy under both Republican and Democratic administrations had spent trillions failing to develop Kabul and Baghdad. He said the modern Middle East was being built by the people of the region themselves, embracing their own heritage, charting their own destinies. He was right. That thesis was correct. The historical record supports it. The catalog of cases I have just walked through demonstrates it. Where we have intervened, we have wrecked. Where we have left countries to determine their own course, they have, on their own terms, moved toward the kinds of outcomes the cheerleaders for intervention claim they want. The president said this on May 13th, 2025. 9 months and 15 days later, the same president launched the largest American military operation in the Middle East in over 20 years.
We watched everything end. They sent us back to save what was left. Three months of work, gone in an hour. We told ourselves we knew what we were doing. Every choice costs something.
To understand what we have done in Iran, we must first understand what Iran was in 2025 and early 2026 before the strikes began. Iran in 2025 was a country in motion. The 2022 protests sparked by the death in custody of Masha Amini, a young Kurdish Iranian woman arrested by the morality police for an improperly worn hijab, had not faded. They had transformed Iranian civil society. The slogan of those protests, "Women, Life, Freedom," had become the most powerful political movement in Iran since the 1979 revolution. It was a movement led by women. It was a movement that named the regime's central instrument of female oppression compulsory hijab and refused to obey it. In the years that followed, enforcement of hijab laws became inconsistent. Tehran women in cosmopolitan neighborhoods increasingly appeared in public dressed in fully Western fashion. Citizen journalist videos posted to social media in 2024 and 2025 showed Iranian women walking openly without hijab through restaurants, cafes, university campuses, and shopping districts. The morality police, dramatically reduced in visibility, had become a target of protest rather than an instrument of compliance. In July of 2024, Iranians elected a president, Masoud Pezeshkian, a reformist physician who had campaigned on platform of moderating hijab enforcement, opening dialogue with the West, and reducing the IRGC's role in domestic life. He won despite the regime's traditional preference for hardline candidates. His election was widely interpreted both inside and outside Iran as an expression of the public's desire for change. In August of 2025, Pezeshkian appointed Ali Larijani as Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council. Larijani was a pragmatist. He was conservative by Western standards, but he was a man with whom diplomatic dialogue was possible. He had served in multiple senior positions across decades. He spoke fluent English and had negotiated with Western powers before. He represented in the constellation of Iranian political figures the closest thing the United States could plausibly want as a negotiator. In December 2025 and January 2026, Iran experienced the largest protests since 1979. Currency collapse, inflation over 40%, and renewed crackdowns by the RGC's Bajil forces against the women's movement had detonated public rage. The regime cracked down hard. Security forces killed thousands of demonstrators, but the protests continued. The women's movement persisted. The hardliners were on the defensive. The reformists were ascendant. The country was, by any honest reading, in the early stages of a transformation that Iranians themselves were driving. Then the United States and Israel intervened. On February 28, 2026, Operation Epic Fury began. The opening hours killed Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The opening hours killed senior IRGC commanders. The opening hours killed Iranian nuclear scientists. The opening hours killed the defense minister. The decapitation campaign was so comprehensive that the Israeli Defensive Forces would later state in an official communication that the targeted Iranian leader had functioned as the regime's effective head. On March 17, 2026, 18 days after the war began, Israeli airstrikes targeted and killed Ali Larijani, the pragmatist, the diplomat, the man Pezeshkian had appointed 8 months earlier, the natural senior negotiator for any cessation of hostilities. He was killed near Tehran. His son was killed alongside him. His chief of staff was killed alongside him. I want to be very specific about the analytical observation that follows. The killing of Larijani was not a tactical strike against an active military commander. It was the elimination of the senior diplomatic figure inside the Iranian government. The Iranian conservative analyst Hatif Salahi described the killing in unambiguous terms. Larijani's absence, he said, would cast a deep shadow over diplomacy and would significantly hinder efforts to negotiate an end to the war. He was correct. In the weeks since, peace talks have collapsed twice. The first round in Islamabad, mediated by Pakistan, ended without agreement. The second round was scheduled for yesterday. The Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, arrived in Islamabad. The American envoys, Witkoff and Kushner, never came. The president canceled their trip at the last minute, citing the very condition his administration had created. There was, he said, tremendous infighting and confusion within the Iranian leadership. The infighting was real. The confusion was real. They were the predictable consequences of decapitation. When you kill the supreme leader, the senior diplomatic figure, the senior military commanders, and the defense minister within a span of 3 weeks, you produce institutional chaos. The chaos is then cited as a reason that diplomacy is impossible. This is not a new pattern. This is the same pattern we watched 4 times this past quarter century. In Iraq in 2003, the United States dissolved the Ba'ath Party and disbanded the Iraqi army through a process called de-Baathification. The senior political and military figures with whom a functional Iraqi state could have been rebuilt were removed, imprisoned, or pushed into exile and insurgency. The vacuum was filled by sectarian militias and eventually by ISIS. The American policymakers who had ordered de-Baathification were astonished in subsequent years when there was no functional Iraqi state to negotiate with. In Libya in 2011, NATO bombs supported rebel forces who killed Gaddafi in a drainage pipe. The senior military and political figures of the Libyan state were eliminated, exiled, or killed in the months that followed. The vacuum was filled by competing militias and then by ISIS, and then by warlords running slave markets. The American and European policymakers who had ordered the intervention were astonished that there was no functional Libyan state to negotiate with. In Syria, in the years following 2011, American policy through CIA program Timber Sycamore armed moderate rebels who turned out in case after case to be jihadists. The senior figures of the Assad regime fled to Moscow when the country finally fell in late 2024. The vacuum was filled by HTS, the al-Qaeda offshoot whose leader had a $10 million bounty on his head until 8 months ago. The American policymakers who had supported the rebels were astonished that the rebels turned out to be jihadists. In Iran in 2026, the United States and Israel have killed the supreme leader, the senior diplomatic figure, the senior military commanders, and the defense minister. The vacuum is being filled by hardliners issuing fatwas for jihad against America, led by Mojtaba Khamenei, the late supreme leader's son, who is no reformist. The American policymakers who ordered the strikes, again, are astonished that nobody knows who's in charge. The pattern is consistent. The pattern is documented. The pattern is repeating in real time. The decapitation causes chaos. The chaos is cited as the reason diplomacy is impossible. The hardliners consolidate, the moderates are eliminated, the country is left more dangerous, more repressive, and more anti-American than before the intervention began. There's one further element that distinguishes the Iran case in real time, and it deserves direct attention. The killings have not stopped during peace talks. On April 8th, a 2-week ceasefire took effect, brokered by Pakistan. During the ceasefire, Israel struck targets in Lebanon. Hezbollah retaliated. Vice President Vance described the Lebanon strikes as a result of, in his framing, a legitimate misunderstanding about whether Lebanon was included in the ceasefire. The ceasefire terms were tweeted the day before. Everybody knew that Lebanon was included in the ceasefire. I knew it. I do not have top secret classified information. It was clear. The whole charade about the misunderstanding to me is smoke and mirrors. Nonetheless, the ceasefire broke down, negotiations stalled. The U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports went into effect on April 13th. The April 16th War Powers Resolution, Massey and Khanna's effort to end the unauthorized war, failed by a single vote, with 3 Republican members absent and 1 voting present. Israel continued striking Lebanon. Iran refused to reopen the Straits of Hormuz. The diplomatic process became theater. Peace talks announced, peace talks delayed, peace talks canceled, while strikes continued in Lebanon and the blockade tightened around Iran. This is the pattern. We bomb our way to a negotiating table that no longer exists because we have killed the people who would have sat at it. We strike during ceasefires and we call it a misunderstanding. We're surprised then when no one wants to talk. President Trump's frustration yesterday, his observation that nobody knows who's in charge, is not a moral failure. It is a logical consequence. We watched it happen in Iraq. We watched it happen in Libya. We watched it happen in Syria. We are watching it in Iran in present tense. And the only question is whether we will recognize the pattern in time to refuse the next intervention that will be sold to us with the same arguments and produce the same results. Who, in fact, has been liberated by Operation Epic Fury? Not the Iranian women. The Mahsa Amini movement, the Women, Life, Freedom protest, was the most powerful indigenous force for change in the Islamic Republic since 1979. It was building. It had captured the imagination of an entire generation of young Iranian women. Its momentum threatened the regime in ways that 20 years of American sanctions had never threatened it. That movement is now in mortal danger. The regime, under existential pressure from external attack, has the perfect domestic justification for crackdown, internet blackouts, mass arrest. The fatwas issued by senior clerics for jihad against America create cover for renewed religious enforcement against the women who had been winning their argument in the streets. The women whose movement we said we admired will be the first casualties of the war fought in their name. And not the Iranian moderates. President Pezeshkian, the reformist whose election in 2024 represented the closest thing to a domestic political opening in a generation, now governs under wartime conditions. Any negotiating concession to the United States is treason. Any moderation in domestic policy is weakness. The reformist president has been rendered politically inert by the action we took. Larijani, the pragmatist who could have led negotiations, is dead. The hardliners who had been on the defensive are now on the ascendant. We have inverted the political balance inside Iran in exactly the wrong direction. And not the Christian communities either. Iran is home to small but ancient Armenian and Assyrian Christian populations who have survived for nearly half a century under the Islamic Republic. Whatever pressures they faced under the regime, they existed. Their churches stood. They had a recognized status, imperfect, constrained, but real. Christians were visited by the Ayatollah Khamenei on Christmas. What we know from Iraq, Libya, and Syria is that ancient Christian communities are among the first casualties of the state collapse. The 1.5 million Iraqi Christians of 2003 became 120,000 of 2024. The 1.5 million of Syrian Christians of 2011 became 300,000 of today. And there is no reason to expect the Iranian Christian community to fare better in conditions of state breakdown. And of course, not the Iranian people generally. By April 11th, 6 weeks into the war, the Iranian government's own assessment placed economic damage between $300 billion and $1 trillion. Civilian casualties have been substantial. Millions are displaced. Inflation, which had already exceeded 40% before the war, has spiraled. The country, whose currency was already collapsing, has been pushed toward economic catastrophe. What about the American people? No, not them either. The Pentagon, by mid-March, had requested an additional $200 billion in war funding on top of the $18 billion already spent. Global oil prices have surged. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 1/5 of the world's oil flowed before the conflict, has been effectively closed. American service members have been killed and wounded at bases across the region. The promise that this would be a short, limited operation has dissolved into a war that the president now says he is in no hurry to end. So who has been liberated? Whose loss has been redeemed? The pattern. The pattern is bipartisan, by the way. President Obama gave the 2009 Cairo speech promising a new beginning with the Muslim world. 2 years later, his administration was bombing Libya. 5 years later, his administration was arming moderate rebels in Syria. The rhetoric was non-interventionist. The actions were the opposite. President Trump gave the 2025 Riyadh speech denouncing the nation builders and the neoconservatives. 9 months later, his administration was bombing Iran. He's supporting Lindsey Graham for a return to the Senate. The rhetoric was non-interventionist. The actions were the opposite. The voters who chose Trump over Harris in 2024, in part because of his explicit peace candidate branding, now watch the same wars continue under a different name. The voters who chose Obama over McCain in 2008, in part because of his opposition to Iraq, watched him expand interventions across multiple new theaters. The pattern is older than this administration. The pattern is older than the last one. The pattern transcends party because the pattern is a function, not a partisan ideology, but of the institutional and economic structure that drives American foreign policy, regardless of who occupies the White House. This is where this episode connects directly to the last episode on the contemporary side. The current war was launched on February 28, 2026, without congressional authorization. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress, and Congress alone, the power to declare war. Congress did not declare war on Iran. Congress did not vote to authorize the operation. The president invoked existing authorities, including the 2001 authorization for use of military force. 60 words written about al-Qaeda 25 years ago to justify a war against an entirely different country, with an entirely different government, on entirely different facts, against, by the way, the direct enemies of al-Qaeda. On April 16, 2026, 9 days ago, Representatives Massey and Khanna brought a war powers resolution to the House floor that would have ended the war by direct congressional vote. The resolution failed 214 to 213, a single vote. The same machinery we described in episode 15B, the absent members, the strategic non-votes, the present votes, protected this war from termination, just as it protects members from accountability for 100 other things. The cheerleaders for this war who demand our sons and daughters fight in Iran cannot name the law that authorized this war. The members of Congress who were willing to be on the record voting to end it lost by one. The institution that the Constitution charges with declaring war has refused to exercise that power. The institution that the Constitution charges with restraining executive war making has refused to do that as well. This is the parlor trick the cheerleaders for war count on. They count on you forgetting our wars require declarations. They count on our accepting blank check authorizations passed a quarter century ago as adequate justification for new wars in new countries against new enemies. They count on our being moved by the moral framing. The women, the Christians, the moderates, the dissidents. Even after 25 years of evidence that the moral framing collapses on contact with the consequences. The cheerleaders for war demand our sons and daughters fight in the name of women they cannot name in countries they cannot find. The women they claim to be saving are usually the ones whose lives are most devastated by what follows. The Christians they claim to be protecting are usually the ones whose ancient communities are obliterated by what follows. The moderates they claim to be empowering are usually the ones who are killed, marginalized, or rendered politically inert by what follows. The pattern is damn consistent. The pattern is documented. The pattern is repeating in Iran before our eyes in the present tense. Whose liberation? Whose loss? The question answers itself.
I warned against entangling alliances. They did not listen. Now you can trace exactly how it happened.
The Consequential Actions podcast is on YouTube. Subscribe and follow each series from the very beginning.
Principled debate requires participation. Like the episodes. Leave a comment. Join the discussion.
Every series is organized as a playlist, from General Welfare to The New Leviathan to Empire of Liberty. Begin at the beginning.
There's a phrase I want to leave with you. The parlor trick of liberation. Across the past quarter century, every American intervention in the Middle East has been justified to the public on humanitarian grounds. We were told we were liberating women. We were told we were protecting Christians. We were told we were supporting moderates. We were told we were supporting freedom. In Iraq, the Christian community of 1.5 million collapsed to 120,000. In Libya, slave markets reappeared on the Mediterranean coast. In Afghanistan, the Taliban returned more restrictive than before. In Syria, an al-Qaeda affiliate became head of state. In Iran, the war is still unfolding, but the early indicators are unmistakable. The women's movement is in mortal danger. The reformist president politically captured, the moderates eliminated, the hardliners consolidating around fatwas for jihad, and a president who 9 months earlier had correctly diagnosed all of this in a speech in Riyadh, now repeating the very pattern he named. Meanwhile, in countries we have left alone, Tunisia, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, and even Saudi Arabia in its own complicated way, populations have made measurable progress on the very dimensions the cheerleaders for intervention claim to care about. They have done it on their own timeline, in their own way, without American troops, without American-imposed political reform. The data is in, the data is clear. The President of the United States in May of 2025 articulated the thesis correctly. He has since contradicted his own thesis with the largest American military operation in the region in over 20 years. In episode 15, I issued a challenge to the listeners of this program. Counter ignorance with information seeking, counter apathy with engagement. We are a highly intelligent society. We have the lessons. We have at our fingertips more information than any generation in human history. The voting records, the casualty figures, the historical comparisons, the speeches that contradict the policies, all of it's public. The only question is whether we apply what we have learned. The cheerleaders for war count on us not applying it. They count on the moral framing landing before the historical record can be consulted. They count on the urgency drowning the questions of why. The same arguments that produced 4 catastrophes are now being deployed to justify a 5th. They count on our forgetting Iraq by the time we hear about Libya, on forgetting Libya by the time we hear about Syria, on forgetting all of them by the time we hear about Iran. The Empire of Liberty series exists in part to refuse that forgetting. 16 episodes in, we have walked through the entire arc, from the founders' warnings against entangling alliances, through the early republic, through the Cold War, through the forever wars, into the conflict happening as we record. The lessons are not hiding. They are documented. They are repeating. And the central question of this series remains, did this leave Americans more free or more governed? But today the question expands, and it must be asked of every population the cheerleaders for war claim to be liberating. Has any intervention of the past quarter century left women freer? Has any left Christians safer? Has any left the moderates ascendant? Has any left the country itself more democratic, more economically developed, more peaceful, more aligned with the values of the intervention it was sold to advance? The answer in case after documented case is no, not by a long shot. The work of recognizing this pattern is ours. The work of refusing the next intervention sold with the same arguments is ours. The work of holding accountable the institution, Congress, that should have stopped the war and did not is ours. The work of seeing through the parlor tricks of false framing and errant labels is ours. We are a highly intelligent society. We have the tools. We have the lessons. We have, even in the Empire of Liberty series alone, 16 weeks of evidence carefully assembled. The next time a president, any president of either party, stands before the cameras and tells us that we must intervene to liberate a population, the question we must ask is the question this episode has been asking throughout. Whose liberation? Whose loss? If the past 25 years have taught us anything, it is the answer to those questions is rarely what the cheerleaders for war want us to believe. And speaking of cheerleaders for war, next Saturday, episode 17, The Bear Baited, will examine the war in Ukraine, the warnings of George Kennan and the realists, the long arc of NATO expansion, and the sequence of decisions that made a preventable war inevitable. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 16, part B of the Empire of Liberty, America's foreign entanglements from the founders to the forever wars, on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page. Every subscription helps bring more and more attention to other people. You can subscribe at consequentialactions.com. Here you'll find all written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the new Leviathan. Also, to help bring visibility to the channel, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. And follow me on X at @JKellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until then, have a great day.
Thank you.